We worried when she refused to move to a city smaller than Springville, but it was your and her decision, so we didn't say anything. Paul turned to his father and said, Dad, I think we should support Jeff on this. Let's get Homer and Jeff together tomorrow and see what they can come up with. Paul then said, It's getting late. Jen, are you ready to go home? He looked at Jeff and said, Jeff, you coming out to the house or staying here? Jeff sat a short while and said, If there's a cabin open, I think I want to go to the lodge. I might get some fishing in while I think about this mess. Call me on my cell when you have the time set up with Homer, please. Jim went into the house and got the key for the resort office. He handed it to Jeff and told him, This is the key to the resort front door, and my office key is the other one. Cabin keys are in the center desk drawer. Use the honeymoon cabin, son. I know it's no honeymoon for you, but the honeymoon cabin is the best and most secluded cabin. Plus, of course, it's closer to the best swimming and fishing holes. We don't have it scheduled for the next few days, so you can use it as long as you want. Do you want to have breakfast with us here or in town? Or do you want to eat at the resort? Jeff thought for a moment, then he replied, I really don't know. Right now, I don't feel much like breakfast. I guess I'll find something out there if that's okay. By the time Jeff drove the 3 miles to the resort, got the key, and unloaded his bags, it was almost 3 a.m. He just stripped and crawled into bed without unpacking or showering. The next thing he knew was when he heard a female voice yell, Mr. Fielding, are you still in here? This is Abigail. Your father tried to call you, and when you didn't answer your cell, he called the office. He says your meeting is set up for lunch. You need to be in the cafe at 12:30 if that's okay. Jeff heard footsteps coming toward his bedroom and hurriedly reached for the bed sheet to pull over himself. He stared at the very lovely woman that walked through the door. He saw her blush and decided she saw him before he got completely covered. He said, I'm sorry, Abigail. I wasn't expecting visitors and, well, you caught me. Abigail let loose with the most enticing giggle and said, That's okay, sir. I'm sorry I barged in here on you like that, but I knocked and you didn't answer. When I came in, I didn't hear you say anything, so I was coming back here to see if you were here or out fishing. Your father said you might be on the river. She looked at him shyly and said softly, Besides, before my family left me, I had 2 brothers. I didn't see anything I haven't seen a lot of times before. Abby smiled and said, It's 10:30 now. Do you want me to find some breakfast for you, or do you just want to wait for lunch? Jeff smiled and said, No breakfast, but if you have some coffee up there, I would be forever grateful if you would share it with me. Abby looked at him and smiled, then she responded, We sure do, and I just made it fresh. Want me to bring some down, or will you have it with me in the dining room? I'll come up. See you in a few. And Abigail, thanks. Jeff arrived at the cafe about 10 minutes early and found his father, grandfather, and a man that was introduced as Homer Scroggins already there. They shook hands and made small talk while they ordered. Then Jeff's father, Paul, said, Son, I've filled Homer in on what you told us last night. Why don't you give it to him again, and then tell us all you know about Harriman's business? If you want, we can go back to the resort before you get into the personal items with Homer. For the next 30 minutes, Jeff told Homer about how Amy was acting and how much time she spent working late and on her business trips. He told him about the small amount of information he had uncovered about the past administrative assistants, their tenure, and that of their secretaries. Jeff was surprised he didn't know more about Harriman's business and vowed he would remedy that problem when he returned home. All he knew for certain was they printed all types of business forms. He was in the business of looking up companies and analyzing their various reports. It would be a little more difficult since Harriman wasn't a publicly traded company, but he could get a lot of information on them. He promised to gather that information and get it back to Homer within a week. When they got back to the resort, Jeffrey invited Homer into his cabin and offered him a drink before they got started. Homer said, No thanks, not right now, but if you want one, feel free. As you know, I recorded our talk in the cafe, and I would like to record this one. Do you mind? Jeffrey sighed and said, No, go ahead. Homer then said, Okay, Mr. Fielding. Please tell me everything you can about your wife, Amy, her job and responsibilities. I also need to know about her friends and clubs as well as anything out of the ordinary you might have noticed over the last few months. Please don't leave out anything that may be even tangentially related to these topics. Jeff sighed and began. He said, Well, Homer, I met Amy in the fall semester of my last year in college. She was going to finish her bachelor's degree in May, and I was going to finish my master's degree the same month. I was the teaching assistant for a business class she was taking. She was beautiful, witty, and always had a large group of friends, both male and female, with her. I was mesmerized by her, but at first I tried to keep my distance as I felt an instructor should. To this day, I'm not sure if she truly had trouble with the subject coursework or if she was feigning a problem, but she kept coming to me for help, and I would give it to her. At first, we met in the library, but after a few sessions, we would adjourn to a local hangout after the session to continue with a conversation we had started or just to relax with a beer. Before long, we started dating. I loved so much about her I fell deeper and deeper under her spell. Amy was caring, kind, and considerate. She and I seemed to like the same things. We both liked the same type of food and movies. We had similar outlooks politically and socially. We danced and partied with the best of them. As we became more and more attached to each other, she cut back on her bar hopping with her friends until we discovered we spent almost every night with each other. By Valentine's Day, I was madly in love with her, and after a romantic meal, I asked her to marry me. She agreed and set the date for June 13th after we graduated. All went great. Her family liked me, and I liked them. The only problem seemed to be with my family. For some reason, none of my family was as enthralled with Amy as I was. They all told me she was witty, charming, and brilliant, but my grandmother especially told me to watch her, that she didn't think she was right for me. When I told them I was going to marry her, though, they all pulled together and helped us out. I don't know if I didn't tell Amy about my plans after graduation or if she ignored me, but when I let her know I was going to work for the family firm and planned to move back here to work, she got upset. She told me there was no way she was going to maroon herself in this little burg, and I had better rethink my career plans. She said she had busted her ass to get out of the little hick town she was raised in, and she would be damned if she would let me maroon her in another one. This was our first serious fight and almost caused us to break up. Finally, I agreed to compromise. I would work for the firm, but we would work and live in Springville. She really wasn't happy with that because to her Springville was way too small a town, but I thought she accepted it fine. After we were located in Springville and she found her first job, the old Amy seemed to return. She was happy and go-lucky again, and we had so much fun. She would go out with friends occasionally, but usually insisted I take her to dances and social functions almost every weekend. She insisted we join the country club so we could meet the right people and network better. After a year went by, she began hinting we needed more money and a better job. She said we had met enough people that surely I could find a higher-paying, more responsible job with some of the larger companies in Springville or even in another city. You know, I have been living on the salary I earned from our company plus what Amy made. We are saving money as it is, but she wanted more. Amy has always wanted to swim with the big fish and go to the expensive resorts and country clubs. World traveling impresses her. Large cities excite her. She thrives on the nightlife and rubbing shoulders with the people she perceives to be rich and powerful. I guess I messed up when I didn't make sure she knew I would rather spend my spare time here fishing and visiting with friends and family. I sometimes feel her need to party and for excitement is causing her to stray. When she was selected as Janet's secretary, after about 6 weeks, she began wearing more expensive and more revealing clothes. By the time she had been in the new position for 6 months, her entire wardrobe had changed. It was still okay for business, but it pushed the limits of what was the correct business attire, if you follow my meaning. Her skirts were short and blouses thin and sexier. She didn't own any business slacks. I questioned her about this and told her it made her look like she was trolling for men at work. That made her extremely angry, and I was cut off for several days before we resumed sexual relations. Before Amy was promoted to administrative assistant secretary, we had sex 4 to 6 days a week. After she became Janet's assistant, sex dropped to 2 to 3 days per week. Now that she is Howard's administrative assistant, I am lucky to get laid once a week. She seems to stay as far away from me as she can when she comes home late from work, and I am not even allowed to see her nude those nights or touch her sexually. She says she is too tired and needs to relax. It's even worse the days she gets back from her long trips. Homer sat pondering and reviewing the written notes he had taken. He occasionally asked probing questions to fill in some blanks. Finally, he said, "Okay, Jeff. With the addresses and signed releases you gave me in the cafe, I think I can get started. If I need anything else, I have your number." Jeff tried to relax, but all he could think about was Amy and their problems. Finally, Sunday afternoon, he decided to return home. Before he left Steelville, Jeff called Amy to let her know he was on his way back. His family didn't want him to go so soon, but understood. The closer to home Jeff got, the more nervous he became. When he pulled into his driveway, there was a strange car in front of the garage door behind Amy's side. Jeff opened the door and drove into the garage. He walked into the house carrying his luggage and saw Amy's boss, Howard, sitting in the living room. Amy wasn't in the room that he could see. When Howard saw Jeffrey, he stood up and said, "Jeffy, we need to have a talk. Why don't you just leave that luggage there and come in here a few minutes?" We need to get some things straight, then I will let Amy finish filling you in. Jeff was immediately furious. Not only had this asshole called him Jeffy, but also he was giving him orders in his own house. He walked into the living room and confronted Howard. I don't like being called Jeffy Howie, and I especially don't like being ordered around in my own house. I suggest you just get your ass out of here before I decide to throw you through that door. Howard laughed and sat back down. He said, "You can try to throw me out, but I don't think you are man enough to do it. I do know if you don't change your attitude, you will be in a world of hurt. Now sit down and shut up until I finish telling you how things are going to be from now on. Your attitude has upset Amy, and because of that she messed up a very important contract for me Friday evening. I lost a contract that would have been worth several $100,000 because she couldn't keep her mind on the negotiations. I had 3 very disgruntled visitors this weekend, and you're to blame, young man. I want you ease up on Amy and let her do the job I hired her to do. She is one of the best assistants I have ever had, and her negotiating powers are second to none. Your accusations and demands have messed up her ability to concentrate, and I will not allow that to continue. You have a little pissant job for a 2-bit company and think you are controlling the ball in this game. Well, let me tell you, sonny boy, I can buy and sell you several times over, and don't for a minute think I will allow you to mess up my business. Now, when Amy comes in here, you listen to her and give her your support, or it will be the biggest mistake of your life." After he said that, Howard stood and sneered at Jeffrey before he turned and walked out the front door. Jeffrey was sitting there in shock when he heard the bedroom door open. He watched Amy quietly walk into the room and take a chair facing him. "Honey, I'm sorry Howard had to be so rough on you. I tried to talk him out of it, but he was so angry when he found out why I was upset Friday. The final straw was when I was so upset I couldn't help with the negotiations Friday evening. I begged him to let me try and reason with you, but he wouldn't let me. Honey, you know he is right though. You have an MBA from Wharton, for God's sake. You don't need to work for a damn feed store. Just support me for the next year or 2 until I can get a better job, then we can leave this town for a larger city where we can make some real money. I'm making contacts that can help you get a really powerful position in a good company. Howard says if you don't leave things alone, he will ruin you, and honey, he can do it. About 4 years ago, a couple of his assistants' husbands started doing just what you were doing. He had this same type conversation with them, but they wouldn't let it go. They divorced their wives and caused the women so much upset they were useless to him. He had to replace both his admin assistant and her secretary at the same time. He ruined the 2 ex-husbands. He has friends on the police force and in business all over this area. The 2 men lost their jobs, lost their wives, and had to leave the area. They couldn't get good references and had to take menial jobs. Oh, Jeff, I don't want that to happen to you, to us. I hate the thought of Mr. Harriman doing that to us. Please just help me do my job. I promise to pay more attention to you." Jeff sat back in his seat and stared at Amy. "I can't believe you just said that, Amy. All I asked of you. All I expect from you is what we vowed before God and family and friends when we got married. I'm sure you remember them, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do us part, and hereto I pledge my faithfulness. I understand a certain amount of travel and late work is possible, but I think you are carrying it way too far. I will not accept things as they are currently. If you already haven't cheated on me and ended this marriage, and if you want this marriage to last, we need to make some changes. The discussion that your boss had with me should have been between me and you. You already brought a man in our relationship. You made a blunder. And as for your boss, if he ever tried that tone with me ever again, he will need help walking." After saying that, Jeff stood and took his bags into the bedroom to unpack. He heard Amy crying while he worked. The next 3 weeks went on as before. Amy worked late, and when she came home, she wouldn't let Jeff near her sexually. He got a quick peck on the lips or cheek, and she would run off for a soak in the tub. She took a long business trip with Howard and her secretary. Jeff was so angry with Amy that the 2 times she tried to get him to have sex with her, he refused. Friday of the 3rd week, Homer called Jeff at work. "Jeffrey, I'm afraid you were right. In fact, this may be the worst case of cheating and betrayal by a wife I've seen for several years. Can you get back home this weekend so I can give you the report and explain what we've come up with?" Jeffrey sighed and said, "Damn. I was afraid of that." "Sure, Homer. Amy's off on another long business trip, as you know. All I had to look forward to was sitting in the house alone again. She doesn't plan to be home until Sunday sometime, as I'm sure you remember. Shall we meet tomorrow morning at the resort, say about 10 a.m.? Jeffrey didn't even bother to call Amy or leave her a note in the house. He knew it was useless to call her on her cell. She never answered calls when she was at her business meetings or on her business trips. He just left. He took enough clothes to stay away for several days. After all, he worked for the family business, so he really didn't need his business attire unless he was going to some important meeting. He had none planned, so only took one suit and a couple of office casual outfits and lots of everyday clothes. Jeff had called his parents and grandparents with the news he was coming, so they had his cabin unlocked and stocked for him when he arrived. Grandpa Jim and his father Paul met him at the resort. His father hugged him and said, "I'm damn sorry, son. Homer wouldn't tell me what he found, of course, since it's your business, but he said it was damn bad." Jim looked at Jeffrey and stepped up to him. He gave him a big hug and whispered, "I know what you're going to be going through. I was there several years ago. I'll be around after Howard leaves, or if you want I can sit in with you." Jeff looked at the two men and thought about it for a moment. He said, "What the hell? I'm sure this is the end of my marriage, and if Howard has what I think he has, I really don't care if the witch is embarrassed. If she cheated, the marriage is over, so what do I care if you see some skin? Come if you want to." After that, they settled Jeff into his cabin and all went back to the main house for supper. Afterwards, they sat on Jim's patio with their drinks and watched the sun go down. Jeff sighed and said, "You know, I really miss this. It almost killed me when Amy wouldn't move back here after we graduated. If I hadn't loved her so much, I think I would have come home without her, and we wouldn't have even gotten married. If this goes the way I think it will, I want to move our research offices back here if you don't mind." Jim looked at Paul and said, "Well, son, I don't have a problem with that, and I don't suppose anyone else will either. I'll check to be sure, but you just plan on making the move. It'll be nice to have most of the family here in town again anyway." Finally, about 11 p.m., grandmother and took a very inebriated Jeffrey back to his cabin and tucked him into his bed, well, figuratively speaking. She helped him into the building and sat him on his bed, then helped him take his shoes and trousers off. He fell back, and she pulled a blanket over him. The next morning, just after 8, Abigail once again woke Jeff up. This time she knocked on the front door, and when he answered, she came into the living area carrying a pot of fresh coffee. "Mr. Fielding, your grandmother told me to have this coffee with me when I woke you up. I'll put it on the stove to keep it warm. Do you want me to make you some breakfast before you have your meeting with Mr. Scroggins?" Jeff poked his head out the bedroom door and said, "Thanks, Abigail. If it's not too much trouble, I would like some breakfast. What are my choices?" Abigail smiled and said, "I can make a country breakfast with ham, sausage, or bacon, or a Western omelet with what I have here, or I can go back and get the pancake makings. Just let me know." Jeff smiled and said, "The Western omelet and hash browns sound great. While you're doing that, I'll just grab a quick shower." Abigail finished the meal and went to the bathroom door to let Jeff know it was ready. She knocked and didn't get an answer, so opened it a crack to tell Jeff his breakfast was ready. She blushed at what she saw. Jeff was sitting nude on the toilet looking at a picture of Amy and crying. The mirror was steamy from his shower, and he was only partly dry. Abigail pulled her head back and spoke louder into the crack, "Mr. Fielding, your breakfast is done." Jeff jumped and answered her in a cracked voice. "Thanks, Amy. I know, Abigail. I'll be right there." Jeff was finishing his breakfast and talking to Abigail when his father and grandfather arrived. Abigail jumped up, loaded the dirty dishes into the dishwasher, and said, "Oh, I'll get on back to the office now. I'm sorry I kept you so long," and ran out of the building. The three men sat drinking coffee and visiting in a desultory fashion until Homer arrived about 9:45 a.m. All three men stood and Jeff let Homer into the cabin when he knocked. After they all shook hands, Jeff asked, "Homer, where do you want to sit? We can use the coffee table for written documents, then if you have DVDs we will be here for the TV, or we can go into the dining area." Homer stood looking thoughtful, then said, "Well, we would be more comfortable in here, and if you want to watch the DVD while I'm here we can, but I have seen it and would advise you to watch it alone, or, even better, just take it to an attorney without seeing it. I'm afraid it's pretty graphic, Jeff. My written report would be more than sufficient if I were you. Some of our operatives are still watching Mrs. Fielding at her business meeting, but this one is just like the others she has attended since we began watching her. We have managed to get some recordings of the daytime activities, and it appears they really do negotiate contracts and transact business during the day. After quitting time, I'm afraid your wife, her boss, and those involved in the negotiations begin to engage in sex. Most of the times we have followed her, Mrs. Fielding spends the entire night having sex with their customers. Mr. Harriman joins in, of course. Then the next morning, she sleeps late before rejoining the negotiations for lunch and the afternoon session. Her assistant also participates in the orgies, but is not as deeply involved in the evening sessions in Springville. We haven't been able to get into the meetings she has at her office to see what goes on there. The few dinner meetings she has had in Springville hotels have not resulted in anything sexual. She did have one private meeting in a closed room that we were unable to access. I don't know what went on there, but the operative following her said there were questionable sounds coming from the room. He did follow her up to a room with two gentlemen. She stayed for about 1 hour then left. She did not look much when she left, but as you know, that proves nothing. After getting the general information and documents from Homer, Jeff thanked him and escorted him to the door. When he returned to the living area, he saw his father and grandfather reading over the report. From time to time, one of them would curse. Finally, Jim threw the remainder of the report onto the table with an oath. He picked up the DVD packet, looked at it, then at Jeff and Paul. He handed it to Jeff and said, "Son, I looked at the pictures of your grandmother and read all the reports. Son, it makes it a lot worse if you see what she's doing. It's bad enough just reading it. What do you want to do with these things?" Jeff stood holding the DVD packet, then with a curse he walked to the player. While he was inserting the first DVD, he said, "I don't think I can hurt much more, and I just have to see it with my own eyes. I'll understand if you don't want to see any of this, but I have to see at least the first little bit." Jeff watched while his father and grandfather walked from the cabin, then hit the play button. The DVD started with Amy, Mr. Harriman, and 4 other men walking into a hotel room. Amy was giggling and playfully swatting at the men's hands as they fondled her. Her blouse was already unbuttoned, and he could tell she had no bra on. The camera zoomed in, and he could see a hickey on her left breast. The date stamp on the DVD showed this was taken the week after he had authorized the surveillance. When the door closed, Amy turned and wrapped her arms around a distinguished older man. They moved into a deep, sensual kiss. While he did this, 2 of the other men were slipping her skirt and blouse off her. Jeff could hear her moan when one of the men began playing with her. For about 5 minutes, Amy stood in the center of a circle of men kissing and letting them fondle her. Howard walked through the connecting door and pulled it partly closed. The men pushed Amy back to the bed, and she fell backwards on it. The older man was definitely in charge. The other 3 deferred to him and didn't approach Amy until he had chosen his position. One by one, they took turns. Jeff was trembling while he watched Amy get ganged. After about 5 minutes, she screamed out in a climax. After Amy relaxed, the silver-headed man pulled his head back and grinned. He said, "Damn, Amy, doesn't that husband of yours take care of you at all? I think you're hotter than you were last month when we were in Springville." Jeff sat in silence a short time, then stood, replaced the DVD in the envelope. He filed the DVD in the envelope with several others and poured himself a water glass of Glenlivet. Jeff walked to the porch of the cabin and was startled to see his grandfather sitting waiting on him. He was embarrassed because he felt the unshed tears running down his cheeks. Jim stood and put his arm around his grieving grandson. "Son," he said, "I know how you feel. I watched your grandma and screw her boss and tried to forget it with the Glenlivet. Son, it just don't work. Have your drink while we talk, then let it go. Do what you have to do and move on with your life." Jeff sat looking at his grandfather and said, "I need the name of a good divorce attorney. I may need a criminal attorney too. I'm going to make that a-hole pay for this. He came into my house and threatened me. He took my wife from me. By God, he's going to pay." Jim thought about the situation and asked, "Did you know any of the men?" Jeff shook his head no and said, "Only Amy's boss. I have the first names of the 4 screwing her the week after I was here. I haven't looked at any of the other DVDs to see if I know any of them, but I don't expect I will. She apparently only screws customers. I expect it would be a coincidence if one of her customers was someone we dealt with for the store or its investment side, and I'm sure none of our friends has had her. Tell you what, son, you let me worry about getting even with Howard for you. I think I may be able to hurt him more than you can and not lay a hand on him. He's not as big a fish as he thinks. You just focus on the divorce and what has to be done for that while I do some checking on our Mr. Harriman and his friends." Jim pulled his cell from his pocket and dialed a number. "Homer, this is Jim Fielding again. Homer, I've got another job for you. Take that information you got for Jeff and find out the names of the men in the pictures. When you get their names, get everything else you can about them too. We want their wives' names, their addresses, their place of employment, church, clubs, the works. I think we're going to teach those a-holes not to mess around with married women." I could hear the DVD while Jeff played it, and they were all laughing and talking about Amy's husband not taking care of her. They knew she was married. I also saw she was wearing her rings, so there is no excuse. I think we're going to hit them in the pocketbook. Jim thought some more and made another phone call. "Steve," he asked. "Steve, this is Jim Fielding. I know it's the weekend, but all you do Saturday is lay around. How would you like to come out to the resort and talk to my grandson and me? He needs a good divorce attorney, and I know you do a good job." "Oh, hell, bring her too, and I'll have and feed you both and make sure you get the good booze and wine." "Okay, We're in the honeymoon cabin. See you in about an hour. After the 2 phone calls, Jim looked at Jeff and said, "Come on. Let's sit on the back deck where we can watch the river while we wait on Steve. He's semi-retired, but he did a damn good job for me. When we get done with those a-holes, they'll wish they had never messed with this family." Jim and Jeff were sitting on the back deck still when they heard a car pull up in front of the cabin. They weren't off the deck when a distinguished older man walked around the side of the cabin and saw them. He looked at the bottle sitting on the table between them and said, "Hell, you didn't even have the courtesy to wait on me before you got into the good stuff. Pour me a stiff one, and then let her rip. I've already got my recorder ready to go so I don't miss anything. When you start, I'll turn it on and get the whole conversation on tape." While they were pouring Steve a drink and getting settled, they heard a car drive off. Jim started around front to see what was going on, but Steve stopped him. He said, "Relax. That'll only be Jolene going over to your place. I told her if I didn't come back out to go on over there. Now give me that drink and let's get started. I want to get the business out of the way so we can get down to some serious drinking." Jim laid out the framework of the problem, and then Jeff filled Steve in on the meat of the matter. After they finished telling him all the facts, Steve leaned back in his chair and steepled his hands under his chin. He seemed deep in thought for a moment, then he asked, "Well, what exactly do you want out of this, Jeff? We can go for the jugular and follow a scorched earth policy, or we can just go the silent easy route. I know you're hurting right now, boy, but think about things before we get started. Sometimes revenge backfires on you if you're thinking about something like that." Jim opened his mouth to respond, but Jeff beat him to the punch. He said, "I have an airtight prenuptial agreement with Amy. I want to follow it to the letter. Basically, it said if either of us is caught cheating, they leave the marriage with only the amount they brought into the marriage. Anything we accumulate after the marriage becomes the sole property of the innocent party. If we have both cheated, we leave with what we came into the marriage with plus half of the marital assets accumulated after marriage. I have not cheated, so I want it all. I think, in fact, you have a copy of the agreement. I think your partner wrote it for me just before we married because you were out of the country." Jeffrey smiled and leaned back in his chair. He took a sip of his drink and said, "In fact, that prenuptial agreement may turn out to be the best thing Amy ever did for me. I was so in love with her, I would have happily married her without one. She insisted we get one because she told me she had 2 cousins and uncle and of course her father that had cheated and then got divorces. She said she always felt the injured party deserved a pound of flesh, plus she didn't want to get left with a poorer lifestyle when get that she actually said when I got caught cheating. She felt she would deserve it all. I am really going to love sticking it to her with her own sword. After the way she has been dissing our family business and our home for so many years, I think she deserves a comeuppance. I am pretty sure she never really understood the scope of our operation or the fact that we are worth millions and were even then. We have remained so low-key that she thinks we only operate a little hick resort and a small feed store in Hicksville, as she puts it. Of course, it helps that we never pay a dividend on the stock, but rather plow the earnings back into the business. I do know the time or two I have bought or sold shares," she has sneered, "because I am playing with a bunch of worthless paper." When Jeff stopped talking, Steve said in an excited manner, "We have a copy of the prenuptial agreement. We actually wrote it for you." He laughed and continued, "If Solange wrote a prenup for you, it has teeth, especially if it says what you say it does. I'll check the files in the office when we get done here. When do you want this all to take place? Do you want to talk to her first and see if you can salvage anything from the relationship?" Jeff sat thinking a moment and replied, "The sooner the better. I don't intend to return to the house except to gather my personal belongings and a few items of furniture to make living here easier. Grandpa has already said I can use this cabin for as long as I want. The corporation has made it part of my compensation package. If you need to reach me, try my cell first, then call here. I'll put an answering machine on the line as soon as I get it from my house in town in case you call when I'm out. Speaking of that, when do you think you can serve her? I'd really like to get my things before it gets out what we've done." Steve thought a moment and said, "Well, if I find the prenuptial agreement in the office, I could have the paperwork finished Monday. I will file it with the court Monday evening or Tuesday morning, then it is just a matter of getting someone to serve Amy in Springville. That can probably be done Tuesday afternoon or Wednesday." Jeff smiled and said, "Fine. I'll wait until she is at work Tuesday before I begin to take things out of the house. I don't want to tip my hand too soon. I would like the papers to be served before Wednesday noon if at all possible, because a lot of weeks they fly somewhere Wednesday afternoon for late week meetings. I would like her to try to work, with the knowledge I was divorcing her hanging over her head. I'd just as soon not have to face her boss again, though. He threatened violence last time I walked into my house and found him there. I don't want to have to beat his bum and take a chance of going to jail for it. Steve looked shocked and said in a loud voice, "What? You didn't tell me he threatened you when you explained he had talked to you about Amy once. What did he say exactly?" Jeff said, "I don't remember exactly. Basically, he told me he would ruin me and run me out of town if I didn't leave Amy alone. He said he had a lot of powerful people that would help him with that task. He also indicated he wasn't averse to using violence on me if he felt like it. I've slept since then and don't remember the conversation exactly." Steve looked at Jeff and said, "Jeff, before you go home, I want you to pick up a small recorder. You should have it with you at all times, and if you have occasion to talk to Amy, her boss, or anyone else associated with this mess, you need to tape it for me. We might get something useful from those conversations. I'll tell Homer to keep up the surveillance on Amy, your home, and her business dealings." Jeff stayed in Steelville until early Tuesday morning, then he took the resort 1-ton box truck back to his home. One of his cousins went with him to help load the vehicle. Things didn't work out exactly as Jeff would have wanted them to. Steve apparently was very efficient because Amy came tearing into the house at shortly after 4:30 Tuesday afternoon. Jeff hadn't finished taking the things he wanted, and she caught him. His cousin was in the backyard shed packing Jeff's tools so Amy didn't see him. When she saw Jeff carrying a box to the truck, she jumped in front of him. She was crying and said through her tears, "Jeff, how could you do this to me? Just because I told you my job was as important to me as yours was and refused to quit, now you think you can divorce me? And what's this about you getting all the marital assets? I worked my ass off for those things just like you did, and you better believe I intend to get my share of them if you insist on this divorce." Jeff looked at her in disgust and said, "Amy, I'm just following the letter of the prenuptial agreement you insisted we make and that we both signed. Get your copy and read it if you don't believe me. In fact, I'm being generous. I'm not taking all the furniture. You can have what I leave if you want it. Otherwise, I will sell it with the house." Amy was furious. She said, "We'll see about that. You just screwed up big time, mister." Jeff watched as she stood aside and made a phone call. He heard her say, "Howard, I just got home and found Jeff loading a truck. He insists on following the letter of that prenuptial agreement he forced me to sign. I guess we have to hit him with the sledgehammer after all." "Okay, I won't, but hurry. It looks like he is almost done loading." Amy walked to the front porch and sat in a chair. She watched Jeff while he loaded the truck. He was just about to walk behind the house for another armload when Howard's car screeched into the driveway. Howard flung himself from the car before it had stopped rocking from being put into park before it was fully stopped. He ran toward Jeff, yelling at him. Howard said, "You damn little pissant. I told you not to screw with me. You've done it now. You have Amy so upset it's already affecting my business. You better have deep pockets, boy, because I'm going to hire her good lawyer, and we're going to break that prenuptial agreement and take everything you have. When I get done with you, you'll be lucky to have the clothes on your back. And no one screws with my business or me. You have just done that, and by God, you're going to pay. I told you before, I own people in this town and have a lot of favors owed me. We're going to make you look so bad even your own parents won't want you around when we're through with you. I told you if you couldn't handle Amy's success to just quietly divorce and get the hell out of town, but you just had to go macho on us, didn't you? You've screwed up royally now. I'm going to kick your bum like I promised to do, then you're going to unload that truck and get the hell out of here." When Howard took his first swing, Jeff ducked, grabbed his arm, and threw him over his shoulder. Jeff held onto the arm and could hear the cartilage pop when it came out of the socket. At least Howard would be lucky if that was all that happened. He landed 3 punches on his face, and before Jeff let Howard go, he kicked him twice, once in the ribs and another time in the crotch. Jeff looked up to see his cousin Joe filming the altercation. They had brought the camera as well as the tape recorder just in case something like this occurred, and now they were both glad they had. Jeff left Howard lying there and returned to the backyard for another load. When he came back, Amy was helping Howard up. She looked at Jeff, her face white, and hissed, "You a-hole. How could you?" She helped Howard to his car, and they drove off, probably to a hospital. The 2 men finished loading the truck and left. Before Jeff and Joe got to the end of the street, they were stopped by a patrol car. 2 officers approached the vehicle and kept their hands on their weapons while they made Jeff and Joe get out, lean on the truck in the position while they searched them. They were both cuffed, and the lead officer read them their Miranda rights. He said, "You are under arrest for assault, battery, and burglary." At the police station, the camera and all their other possessions were taken. Jeff had left the recorder inside the truck in his jacket pocket. Since it was after closing time, Jeff made his one phone call to his father. When he explained what had happened, he thought his father was going to have a stroke. The next morning, Jeff and Joe were allowed to see their attorney, Steve, as soon as he arrived from Steelville. Steve grinned when he saw them and said, "Can't you two stay out of trouble? Now tell me exactly what happened and we'll get you out of here as soon as we can. They have scheduled your preliminary hearing for 11 this morning." At the hearing, Steve was explaining to the judge that there was a divorce in progress and Jeff was merely removing some of his personal items from the premises. He further stated since Jeff owned the residence, there could be no burglary. The judge thought that one over, and the prosecutor said, "Your Honor, there is a restraining order in effect keeping Mr. Fielding 500 feet from the person of Amy Fielding, her place of residence, and her place of employment." Mr. Fielding violated that order. His altercation with Mr. Harriman was over that, as well as the fact he was not supposed to be removing items from the home until after said divorce. Steve turned to Jeff and asked, "Why didn't you tell me about the restraining order?" Jeff replied, "I've never seen a restraining order or been served with one. This is the first time I even knew she had one. Your Honor, my client states he has never been served with a restraining order and has no knowledge of it. It also seems strange to me that Ms. Fielding was served her divorce papers at 3:37 that afternoon, returned home at 4:30, yet had time to see an attorney for a restraining order, have it filed with the court and served before her husband began removing his personal property that morning. Could I see this restraining order in question and proof that it was served?" The prosecutor looked nervous and began shuffling his papers when the judge asked for a copy of the order. He said, "Your Honor, I don't have a copy of it with me. When I talked to Mr. Harriman, he assured me one was in force and he would see I got a copy. Let me check with my office." He made a phone call and then turned to the judge. "My assistant is bringing the order to me right now. Can we move on while we are waiting on it to arrive?" The judge set his lips and nodded his head. "Please do." "Yes, sir." "Thank you, Your Honor." Now on to the assault charge. Mr. Fielding saw Mr. Harriman approaching him in his yard, trying to keep him from loading more of Ms. Fielding's belongings. He dropped the box he was carrying and began to assault Mr. Harriman, causing grievous bodily harm. I have a sworn complaint from Mr. Harriman and the statements from the hospital emergency room and the officer that interviewed him and Mrs. Fielding. Jeff leaned to Steve and said, "That's a bunch of bull. I have the recording you said to make, and Joe made a DVD of the whole thing. Unless they've taken it, the recorder is in my coat pocket in the truck, and the police have the camera in our belongings." Steve said to Jeff, "Good. That should help, and if the investigator on Amy got some good pictures too, we can stick this to them pretty easily." He then stood and said, "Your Honor, my client tells me that he did not attack Mr. Harriman. He states unequivocally that he was merely defending himself from Mr. Harriman's attack. He has a recording and a DVD that will document that assertion. Additionally, there was a private detective following Ms. Fielding during that time. He also should have pictures in his investigative report to support my client's assertions." The judge sighed and said, "Well, where are these pieces of evidence?" "Your Honor, the police have the camera with the belongings of both Mr. Fieldings. The tape is in their vehicle in a coat pocket. We have not been provided the investigator's report at this time. If we can adjourn until we can obtain these items, I believe we can clear up this mess and let everyone get on with their business." The judge looked at his watch and said, "It's almost noon. Court adjourned until 1:30 for lunch and additional evidence. I presume this will be enough time for you both to obtain the items you should have had in your possession when this hearing commenced." Jeff and Joe were led away to their holding cell. Steve called the investigators to expedite receipt of the surveillance report for the day before, then went straight to the police office to obtain the camera. When he got there, he was given the camera, but when he tried to play it, he found there was no DVD inside. Arguing with the property officer had no effect. He swore that what Steve had was all they took into care. Strangely enough, the inventory showed the camera but made no mention of a recording disc. Steve went on to the impound yard. He arrived there just as an officer was opening the door of the truck. He walked up to the officer and asked, "What are you doing opening this truck?" The officer looked nervous and said, "This truck might contain evidence in a burglary and I am searching it for that evidence. Besides, what right do you have to ask me about my duties? I'd better see some identification. You're not even supposed to be here in this yard unescorted." About that time, a grizzled old officer walked up to Steve and said, "Mr. Jensen, I'm having trouble finding the key for the truck here. It isn't in the key rack where it's supposed to be." The officer confronting Steve looked upset and paled visibly when Steve said, "Do you suppose the key might not be where it belongs because this officer has it in his hand without authorization?" The officer started to back away and found his way blocked by the other officer and Steve. The impound officer said, "Patrolman, do you have the key to this truck? If you do have the key, hand it over right now. This gentleman has authorization from the court to remove a tape recorder alleged to be within this vehicle." The officer slowly handed the key to Steve and started to walk away. Before he got out of sight, the impound officer caught him and demanded to see identification. Reluctantly, the officer handed it over, then left in a hurry. Steve found the tape recorder and heaved a sigh of relief when he found it still had the tape within and it was in good condition. He didn't listen to the whole tape, but what he heard seemed to agree with what Jeff told him. Before he left the impound lot, he thanked the officer and got the identity of the one who was trying to open the truck without authority. When court resumed, the judge called the attorneys to the bench. He asked, "Well, did you obtain the information we needed during the recess?" The prosecutor said, "Yes, Your Honor. Here is a copy of the restraining order. As you can see, it was filed shortly after 4 p.m. yesterday. Clearly, Mr. Fielding was in violation of this order when he was at his former residence." The judge looked at the order, then turned to the prosecutor and asked in a sarcastic tone of voice, "I wonder how an order can be filed at 4:20 in the recorder's office several miles from the accused residence, then driven across town in less than 30 minutes to be served. I also noticed that the officer serving the order was the first patrol car on the scene and stopped the truck at the end of the block, thus making the arrest. Apparently, Mr. Fielding was never formally served the restraining order. Isn't it a little strange that you were trying to prosecute Mr. Fielding for violating an order he had yet to see, one that wasn't even filed until after he began removing his belongings from his residence?" The prosecutor looked sick and was spluttering when the judge finished his statement. The judge turned to Steve and said, "Counselor, I hope you have better documentation for your side of the case than the honorable prosecutor does." Steve looked at the judge and said, "I think so, Your Honor, but I don't have all the evidence I should have. In fact, I am lucky I have any evidence at all." Steve explained what he found at the property room of the police station, and then he explained getting to the impound yard just as the officer was trying to open the door. When the judge found the officer had unauthorized access to the key and was trying to use it, he grew angry. "Your Honor, I haven't listened to all of the tape, but I do know it was operating. Shall we listen together?" At a nod from the judge, he pressed play. There was silence in the courtroom as the tape droned on. The longer it played, the more upset Howard and Amy looked. They stood to leave, and as they walked out, Howard glared at Jeff. After the tape ended, the judge thought a moment, then banged his gavel down. "Case dismissed. Mr. Fielding and Mr. Fielding, you are free to go. I trust you won't violate the restraining order now that you know about it." Jeff and Joe followed Steve out of the courtroom. Their first stop was the property room. Then they moved on to the impound yard to pick up their truck for the tower drive home. Steve followed them to the cabin and had a drink with them while they discussed the day's events. Joe went home and Jeff and Steve continued to talk. Jeff said, "Mr. Jensen, I don't know what my grandfather is going to do to help me, but I want that a-hole broken. I want his reputation ruined, and I want his business closed if at all possible. I also want that conniving which I married ruined. Can we do that legally, or am I going to have to do something else?" "Well, they're Haas," Steve said. "First off, I told you to call me Steve. Secondly, I don't want you to go off half-cocked on me now. We just got you out of one scrape. Now you calm down and let your grandfather and me work on this for a while. I don't know exactly what he is thinking about, but if I know your grandfather, he's not going to hit that little pissant with a sledgehammer. He's going to use an atomic bomb. He told me he would be talking to you in a day or two about things, so you just calm down and wait. You hear me?" Jeffrey didn't have anything important to do in the office, so he decided to take the next few days off relaxing and arranging his belongings in the cabin. He turned the second bedroom into an office and displayed his personal items in the other rooms. He replaced some of the furniture with his own, but kept most of the resort's furniture in the building to use. Jeff saw Abigail several times a day and began to get to know her. She still brought him coffee in the mornings and either cooked his breakfast in the cabin or brought him some of the food left from feeding the fishermen at the main lodge. Several times Jeff told her she didn't have to do that, but she would laugh and say, "I never saw a man yet that could cook worth a damn, and my daddy always told me a good breakfast was the most important meal of the day. Your grandmama told me to look out for you, and I'm going to do that." Unless Abigail was busy, she took to eating her breakfast with Jeff, and he grew to enjoy her company. One evening, he was sitting on the deck watching the sunset and drinking some Glenlivet when Abby came down the trail from the main lodge. She was obviously heading for the swimming hole. She was carrying a towel and cooler and was wearing a conservative two-piece swimsuit. When Abigail saw Jeff, she stopped to visit with him. They talked for several minutes and Abby finally climbed up on the deck to sit with Jeff. After a few more minutes of conversation, she said, "If I'm going to get my swim in before dark, I really have to go. I'll see you in the morning." As she started to leave, she turned back and said, "Hey, come on with me and swim a while. It's way too hot to just sit there in all those clothes and drink." Besides, you've been drinking way too much. You need to work some of it out of your system. Jeff refused even when Abigail pleaded with him, so she finally came back up on the deck and sat down beside him. She leaned over and opened her cooler and took out a black cherry wine cooler to drink. They sat in silence for a short time, and Jeff finally looked over at her and said, "I thought you were going to swim? Why are you sitting here?" Abby looked at him and replied, "Well, I don't like to swim alone, and I know it's not good to drink alone, so since you won't go with me to the swimming hole, I guess I'll just have to sit here and melt while we drink the evening away." Jeff sat there and watched her for a minute, then said, "Oh, okay. If you're going to be like that, I guess I'll go with you. Let me get my suit." Abby grinned as she watched him walk a little unsteadily into the cabin. She was sure she heard him fall down while he was dressing, but she didn't go check. After they got well cooled off, Jeff climbed out of the water and lay back on one of the beach towels they had brought. Abby followed him. They were lying there talking and watching the nightfall when Jeff asked, "Abby, I know it's none of my business, but why are you here? I've heard you say your folks moved off and left you, but why didn't you go with? For that matter, why aren't you going to college? I can tell you're an intelligent girl, and yet you're in this dead-end job working for our company." Abby's eyes teared up, and she turned to Jeff to say, "Mr. Fielding, it's none of your business why my parents moved, and I stayed here. Furthermore, if you can't let it drop, you can just find someone else to swim with. For your information, I am going to college. I take 1 or 2 courses a semester, and I do well in them. I would like to take more courses, but that is all I can afford right now. I have 27 semester hours completed now. It will take me some time, but I will have my degree. I'm going for a degree in hotel and restaurant management so I can run a place like this. Now are we going to talk about something else, or am I going to leave?" After she said that, Abby stood and began gathering her belongings. Jeff scrambled up too and grabbed her by the arms. He stood looking into her eyes and said, "Abby, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you or hurt your feelings. I just truly wanted to know more about you. If you don't want to talk about it, we won't, but if it's something you need help with, I would be glad to help you." When he grabbed her, Abigail tensed up and tried to pull away. When she couldn't get away from Jeff, she stood and glared at him. Jeff didn't back down, and finally Abby sighed and relaxed. She said, "Oh, okay, Jeff. I'm sorry I overreacted, but I don't like to think about that. You see, I love this place and couldn't bear to leave it. My parents owned it but weren't ever able to make a living on it.